Our presenter tonight is Warren Murphy on the history of religion in Wyoming and the different ways it still is affecting us, has affected the growth of Wyoming. As you can see, here's our fancy name. We put a lot of work into this, didn't we, Kayla? We did. We are joined tonight by some people on Zoom, and this is going to be recorded, and we are going to take some questions. And so if you have questions for Warren, do you want those afterwards or do you want those?
I'll have 2 places for those.
Okay, he's got places for the questions, and so we'll track that. Warren is an Episcopal priest, has been working in Wyoming for too many years to mention. He's written a couple of books. What else should I say about you? And has recently gotten back from Hawaii. How's that?
Yeah, we'll keep this very informal, okay? So we do have a number of people on Zoom. How many of you got on there?
We have officially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people on Zoom.
And I know
We have more signed up, so maybe they'll join us.
Okay. And we do have, for all your information, our group of our class here of the Leadership in Faith class. And this is the first presentation in Cody. And they'll be busy tomorrow all day long, doing field trips and sharing ideas and concerns about the state of Wyoming. And on top of that, then they'll be here Saturday morning to do a few more tours. And we're doing this all over the state of Wyoming. And they'll go to different towns over the period of this year. So it's an experimental program, see how it works, to train people to be leaders and to be social justice oriented as they so define it. And they asked me to do a little bit on the history of Wyoming, because folks here, some are new, some are old, but a lot of people in the state really don't know that much about the state. We've discovered that, especially the Wind River Reservation. And I want to focus on that a little bit tonight. So this presentation is going to be really in 2 parts. First part, as was originally asked to do, was to explain, as we're doing in each location, to explain different denominations and different faiths. So when they were in Sheridan last week, Muhammad Salih talked about Islam and what it means to be a Muslim in Wyoming. And also, I think we got a little bit about the Presbyterian Church as well. And tonight I was asked to do a little thing about the Anglican-Episcopal Church, and then how that affected Wyoming and how other churches joined this in being part of Wyoming. So that's what I'm going to do. And so 2 parts. So let me do the first part, just a little bit to let you know what the Episcopal Church is, because that explains a lot about what we do and who we are. And first of all, to let you know that the Episcopal Church derives from the Church of England, which broke in, and by the way, this whole history thing I'm doing here is just an abbreviation. I've got a 10-week course I do just on the Episcopal Church, which I won't bore you all with because some of it's a little dry, but a lot of it's sort of fun and fascinating. And I'll try to touch on some of those things. Episcopal Church derived from the Church of England, which broke away from the Roman Catholic Church during the famous Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. And this break was a little bit different than the other Protestants, the Luther and the Lutherans and others who used the occasion to get away from Rome and away from the Pope and start their own version of what was for them theologically significant. And the Church of England, a little bit different. Theirs was more political than religious. King Henry VIII at the time was a very robust, I would think, narcissistic character who believed very much in himself. And he was really agitated over the fact that the Pope could run England. So the Pope ran everything in those days. All the countries of Europe, I mean, you bowed down to the Pope. And this, after the Reformation began, it was King Henry's idea. This is my opportunity to break away, but I just want to get away from the Pope and run my own kingdom the way I want to run it. So Henry VIII did that and he wasn't really opposed to what the Roman Church was saying at the time, just the Pope. And so he decided he'd have his own church, which would be the Church of England. And he'd pick his own Pope, who happened to be called the Archbishop of Canterbury. And at that particular time, and I've got some pictures here, which I will show you. I don't have the fancy slide hookup, but it's a lot faster to go this way. He picked his own first Pope. His name was Thomas Cranmer. Does that fit pretty well? See Thomas Cranmer's photo on there.
It's not too bad, but let's bring it even closer.
All right.
We'll get Cranmer right up in there in that.
Just good 16th century English glory. He was author of the Episcopal Church's prayer book, amongst other things, very colorful history of his own. But he became the king's religious leader and the head of the Church of England, the first head. And by the way, what the Anglican Church was doing, Church of England did, was they were most represented by what they called the via media, which is what we want to do as we start. We want to be loose enough that we can sort of compromise when we have to, be the middle of the road, be the center. Other churches were getting tied up in theology. We wanted to sort of be friends with everybody. People tend to disagree. And so that's what happened during the years, even in the Church of England. But the Church of England became synonymous with large and went all over the world. And everywhere in the world that England went, so the Church of England went as well. And local churches were then formed, local Church of England, Anglican churches as they're called, throughout the world. And that included North America. And in North America, the Congregationalists had already come up in Massachusetts, you know, all the story of Puritans, et cetera. But the English got here a little later. And on April 26th of 1607, the first English colony was established in Virginia. And of course, the Church of England came with it. And actually, in that first gathering, they brought a clergyman, their chaplain. They called him their own chaplain. And his name was the Reverend George Hunt. And he was the one to establish really the first Church of England, Anglican church in North America. And I point that out because this was in Virginia. And even today, Virginia is sort of the homeland, the motherland of the Episcopal Church. But there were a number of firsts I'd mentioned. People like firsts. First do everything. And a number of firsts took place there in Virginia with that first colonial gathering. First one was the first marriage. And it was a fellow named John Rolfe, who was a tobacco farmer, basically. He was the one who created tobacco as a major crop. And he decided to marry a woman that I think everybody's familiar with. Her name was Pocahontas. Pocahontas. And it's a classic story of white colonist meets native person. And of course, then Disney took it over and made Pocahontas quite popular in terrible, terrible ways. And you all probably have seen pictures of Pocahontas, cute little Indian girl with a little feather and whatever. But it was a little bit different than that. He married her and took her to England to show her off and gave her a new name. And the new name was Lady Rebecca. And this is her picture as portrayed as Lady Rebecca. And see, as you can see, it's quite different than the Disney version. They painted her up as being a very delicate English lady, even though she was.
Can we pass that around?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
And we might, the people here might appreciate.
There's Cranmer too. We just pass him around as well. So that was the first marriage, and actually, as the story goes, it was pretty sad. She went over there and was displayed and showed off, and eventually she died in England. And they say it was of a broken heart and homesickness. So the first marriage didn't turn out all that well. But there were some other firsts. One of the oldest colleges in America, probably the second oldest in 1693, William and Mary College was created there by those first settlers and by the church, named after King William and Queen Mary of England at the time. And later, one of our first major communities, Williamsburg in Virginia, came as a result of all this. They first landed at Jamestown, and then Jamestown was a hard place, and they moved up the river a little bit, James River, to Williamsburg. And there, the first actual Episcopal parish was created, being Bruton Parish, as it was called. There were other early churches as well in America, because the Church of England was there very early. And I have a picture of a couple of them here I can show you, but one of the first was Christ Church in Philadelphia. Christ Church is most famous because it's located very close to Independence Hall. And actually, the first the clergyman who was there at the time of independence was a fellow by the name of William White. And he was the pastor rector of that church, very prominent in the early days. And he was actually the chaplain of the Continental Congress when we created the Constitution. And Christ Church, Philadelphia today is a very prominent place, downtown Philly. Another one was Trinity Church in New York. And I do have a picture of Trinity. I'll show you that one too and pass it around. Some of you have probably seen this on television. Usually when you see Wall Street, you look down Wall Street and they have this tiny little church that sits at the end. And it's a classic Gothic church, and it is Trinity. And everybody feels sorry for that poor little church that got lost in the middle of all these rich skyscrapers in the most valuable part of the whole world, money-wise. Don't feel sorry for them. They're considered possibly one of the richest congregations in America. Not even a congregation, the church itself. I checked today just to see how much they were worth, and it comes out roughly to about $6 billion to $8.3 billion. They own Wall Street. They literally own it. So don't ever feel sorry for that little church at the end of the street. They are very generous with their money. They have a world giving program, and they give out quite a bit of it. But they're the ones that got the original tract from the Queen to actually have that land and set up that. Columbia University also came out of that. So a lot of things were happening in the colonial period. Then the American Revolution came along, and then they had a real problem because they were English and because they were fighting the English. There were two groups of people within the church, as there were in the whole country. There were the Loyalists and the Patriots. And the Loyalists, of course, were the people who really didn't want to break away from England. And many of them were Church of England and wanted to just stay Church of England. Others, known as the Patriots, wanted to break away for all the reasons you know from your history. And they decided to stay to break away, but also they wanted the church to do the same thing. And so what happened was the Church of England, many of the Loyalists had to leave, really. And the Patriots who stayed renamed the church the Episcopal Church. Episcopal simply comes from the word bishop. And because the Episcopal Church had never really broken away from the Roman Catholic tradition of laying on of hands for bishops, they still did that. So to have a bishop, you had to have hands laid on you from bishops dating all the way back to the time of Peter being the first bishop, the first pope. So that created a problem because they didn't have any bishops anymore once they broke away. How do you keep that line of succession going? So this break took place, and the church was then without any bishops. And, you know, Episcopalians like Catholics, boy, they really get strict on that. Unless you had your hands laid on you, you can't carry on the tradition. That symbol was very powerful. And so what are you going to do? They took over the country, but now they have no bishops. So they decided they'd just sort of force their way into it. But the only place they could get ordained as a bishop was through the Church of England that they just broke away from. So one fellow by the name of Samuel Seabury, he had a better idea. He'd go to the church in Scotland, and there they made him a bishop. And then it took a while, but 3 more were determined that they needed to be bishops, and they sent them to England and somehow finagled to get the hands laid on, and they became bishops as well. And I'll give you their names, the first 3 that went to England. One was William White, who was that priest in Philadelphia, went even farther than that. Another one was Samuel Provost, who came from New York. And the third one was a guy named James Madison. All this took place in 1786. And I will point out, this is not the James Madison who became president, but it's a relative. I think they were cousins. All these English people who stayed with the Church of England, had a lot of English connections. So anyway, the church gets formed, Episcopal Church, in 1789, and it was Bishop William White who was really the formulator of the whole deal. And he designed it, he needed a design for how this church should be administered. We're not going to do it from a pope anymore, and we're not going to do it through royalty or how they do it in England with the king appointing. So he thought about it and he said, well, let's design it after the American government system. And he was right there when they created that. And so that's how it got formed. So in the Episcopal Church, you have a bishop who is like the head, the president. And then you've got a House of Delegates, which is like the House of Representatives. And you've got a House of all the bishops, and there were only a few at that time, who were just like the Senate. And they passed legislation in much of the same way. So the point I want to make here is that the Episcopal Church comes directly out of the formation of this country. And that tradition stayed pretty much alive throughout the years.
And instead of calling the head bishop, archbishop, he's called presiding bishop.
Presiding bishop at the present time, right? Now,
Did it used to be called the archbishop?
No, never. Anyway, how this went on was the via media stayed there. That was still the emphasis. Let's say, try to be equal with everybody and keep them in line. During the War of 1812, very little divisions, even though we were fighting the British, and the British burned the country basically. Things played, the only interesting thing about that, this one, is that there was a very prominent Episcopalian at the time, by the name of Francis Scott Key. Anybody familiar with that? And he actually wrote a hymn that's in our hymnal. And I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And I'll read the second line. The second line, not the first one, everybody knows. Oh, thus be it ever, when free men shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. The first line goes, oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light, and so on. The national anthem was taken from this particular hymn, which is called, oh, say, can you see? A little side note about the War of 1812. And then the church in the Civil War did divide, but not officially. And many of our denominations did during the Civil War. Baptists went Southern Baptist, Northern Baptist, or American. The Methodists divided into South and North. They did get back together again. Churches split over the Civil War and over the issue of slavery. And the Episcopal Church never officially split, but some of the major players of the Confederacy were Episcopalians. I'd mention a few. One would be Robert E. Lee, who was the Major General of the South. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, both of them Virginians. And another one I'd mention is Bishop Leonidas Polk. I named him because he was very unique. He actually, in addition to being the Bishop of Louisiana, was a Confederate general. And even today, there's an Air Force base that's going to be renamed shortly, called Polk Air Force Base in Louisiana.
It's going to be named that?
Going to be renamed that. It's that now. It's going to have a new.
It's going to have a new name.
New name
Taking
and
away
not-
Confederate names,
okay.
right? That's
That's what I
part of the
thought.
plan. So that's another little sidelight that's sort of fascinating to note. But after the Civil War was over, they all got back together again. It never officially broke as North and South. The 19th century, moving right along here. By the way, this is William White, and his pictures. He looks like a George Washington type guy.
He does, yes.
He started.
This is William White, one of the original bishops.
As the church moved on through the years, there were splits, there were divisions, there were arguments, as every denomination, every group does. But it still kept the via media, sort of, let's include everybody, let's try to get along. It was all part of the Anglican tradition. But the church did move in the 19th century into what pretty much we call today's social justice. But in those days, it had a name, special name called the social gospel. And the whole idea was we need to be more than just a bunch of worshiping people in buildings. We need to be people who are out there making a difference in the world, especially when it comes to justice issues. And so because of that, we got a lot of prominent people who were leaders of that. Most of that, by the way, was begun by a guy named Sheldon, who wrote a book called, it's Our Country. He's the one who created the line, what would Jesus do? That's how you develop your ethics. What would Jesus do? But a number of Anglicans picked that up, Episcopalians at this point picked that up. And one of the most famous was a guy named Phillips Brooks, who was a rector both in Philadelphia and then later in Boston. Very prominent one of the best preachers the Episcopal Church has ever had, known for his preaching. But he was also known for something else. He wrote a hymn in the hymnal that's used every year. It's called O Little Town of Bethlehem. And that's one of his calls to fame. Also, this is Phillips Brooks, very educated looking.
And this was the guy who wrote A Little Town.
Town of Bethlehem, right? He wrote it after having been in Bethlehem and was reminded of his Sunday school class. He wrote it for a Sunday school class. And then, of course, we have one of the other things that most people know about the Episcopal Church is another particular church building. And this is it. And that looks like a cathedral. And it is. It's the Washington Cathedral, or the National Cathedral, or its official name is the Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul. It has 3 different names, but that's our national cathedral. And it's interesting because it was started in 1907, wasn't completed until 1991.
Oh, good grief.
Yeah, it took a long time to build that thing. And it became more than just an Episcopal congregation. It's now used as the symbol of national religion in reality. And all famous people get to be buried from there. A couple of people are buried in the building. And many of the past bishops are buried there. Anyway, it's a major place. And if you see services of presidents who died, whatever, it's always done in the National Cathedral. They call it the National Cathedral. And I'll never forget meeting with one day when we were having a gathering there at the National Cathedral. And the dean of the cathedral at the time was telling us the story of when he first became dean. He said he had a visit in his office. And the visit was from people with suits and ties on, and they needed to see him in private. And he's thinking, what's this all about? And it's a special contingent. I can't remember which part of the federal government. It might be Capitol Police, I'm not sure. Secret Service, I guess it would have been. And they presented him with the plan that is given to all the deans to say, this is what happens when a prominent person in Washington dies. You follow this script. And he said he was just told he had to do it. So much for the independence of even a church rector. And he had to follow that line, and it's been followed every time. So that's a scripted service that takes place.
So they weren't just talking about security issues and stuff like that. They gave him a program for the
security is all part of
worship
it.
service.
It's what they do to keep security and whatever. That's all part of it. But here's the directions for you and the kind of service it's going to be. And then in recent years, and I'm talking early 1900s, something else happened when all these churches were developing, and you'll be hearing about them as you go through this course. One of the things that happened here was a thing called fundamentalism began to take shape in the country, done by the Protestant church as such. And it came from an actual document called the Fundamentals, which were written in 1910, very strict rules that should be followed, very harsh rules that should be followed. And the fundamentalists got known as being the folks who are going to take scripture for every single word literally. And the Episcopal Church, like many of the Protestant churches and even the Catholic Church for the most part, did not follow that. And they decided that they were going to continue with their own traditions and be much more open to what scripture has to say rather than follow it by rote. So the Episcopal Church is one of those that stayed away from that. And it got involved with a lot of social issues, including slavery issue. Slavery still was sort of there even after slavery. And they got into very heavily becoming a benefit church for Black people. Now, it's different than what we do today, where we try to integrate everything. This was to make sure that they had equal types of settings. So Black colleges were established. They were predominantly all Black, mostly in the South. St. Paul's being one, which is in Virginia. St. Augustine's in Virginia. There's a college in South Carolina called Voorhees, and that's another one that's part of this tradition. And they also had a seminary in Alexandria, Virginia, which was an African-American seminary, which was sort of tied to the white seminary called Virginia Seminary. But they were separate but equal. But that was for them a very progressive thing in those days. Also into all kinds of other ministries. One in particular of note is the ministry to the deaf, and probably the creators of that. And it was done by a fellow by the name of Thomas, I think his first name was Thomas Gallaudet. And he decided that deaf people needed to be included like everybody else. And that was his ministry. And deaf ministries had taken off after that. And he founded a college in Washington, D.C., which is called Gallaudet College. I've been there, it's a very cute little place on the east side. So all these types of things were taking place, more involvement, more in the community. And I'll mention that to finish this little section, with some of the issues that they got involved with, because they really felt, the Episcopal Church feels at this point, that religion and the secular world are not totally separate. They go together. One feeds the other. And it's our involvement as Episcopalians to be involved in that. We're not just in a church building, but we're in a community. And some of the people who made that possible, and I'll show you their pictures. These are some firsts again. The first African-American bishop in the Episcopal Church, and that wasn't until the 80s. And her name was Barbara Harris. And that is her picture. At least she was consecrated. She's still alive, and she looks much older now, by the way. But she was the first. She was an outgoing, very aggressive person, and they made her the first African-American bishop. And then later on, most of the bishops had been men, white men, but we had the first woman bishop, and her name was Catherine Jefferts Shorey. And she was also a fairly aggressive person. Said what she thought. She came from Nevada. Had been she's a scientist before she was the presiding bishop. She's the one who she's the Episcopal Pope at this point, presiding bishop. And then our present presiding bishop is quite colorful, quite controversial. He is African-American Bishop Michael Curry. I don't know how many of you have ever seen him in action. Anybody here? I know Rob has. Michael Curry was the one, by the way, did the last royal wedding, and upset all the British because he pretty dynamic speaker, and he speaks in African-American language. And that's Michael Curry. I point him out as well. His father was one of my mentors when I was first ordained in Buffalo, New York. And whenever Bishop Curry is interviewed on television or any place, Always love it because right behind him, he has a Buffalo Bills helmet sitting there.
Well, you said he was controversial. What makes him controversial?
He's just mostly a speaker. He'll say anything and just provoke things and just get out there, and people love to hear him because he's humorous.
And Anne Marie Delgado before that says, Matthew Shepard's ashes are buried there. I'm assuming she means at the National Cathedral. Matthew Shepard was the young gay person who died, was murdered.
And that's again one of the issues.
2020? Yeah, no, 2000.
Yeah, it was a
Environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, Matthew Shepard's buried there. I mean, no,
In the National
Cathedral. You can be buried there. It takes a special designation to do that.
Yeah.
I'm forgetting here now, having my own mental block, the person who was blind and deaf,
Oh, Helen Keller?
Helen Keller. Helen Keller is buried there, as well as the woman who looked after her.
Oh,
They're buried side by side.
Sullivan.
So all of these major issues today that are out there, the Episcopal Church takes sort of a pride in the fact that we're not afraid to deal with those issues. And we do get a lot of criticism for that from other sources. So I'll end this whole thing by simply saying, we've had divisions, we've had disputes, but we are forward-looking. We are small in number, very small actually, by comparison to some of the Southern Baptist, Roman Catholic, or even LDS. But nonetheless, we have been very influential on the passing of American history. And the goal has always been to follow this via media, the middle way, the compromise, get along, keep moving forward. And so I'd sort of end it right there. By the way, most presidents still have been Episcopalians.
Most presidents?
Presidents of the United States.
Oh, okay.
Most recently was George H.W. Bush. Even Harry Truman, I think, considered himself an Episcopalian, even though he was mostly a Baptist. Anyway,
He's from
his
Missouri.
daughter was a very famous Episcopalian, who played the piano. So that's the first part. And any other questions about that particular thing before I go on to the locals?
So for our Zoom audience, he's leaving us some time to ask some questions.
And from you all too.
What is the numbers of the population of the Episcopal Church,
Episcopal Church. You know,
as far as you know?
as far as we know, that's always a tough one because we take an official record and then everybody says, oh, that's not right. You know, it's like the census, you know, same thing. The last I heard it was about 2.9 million. And that includes not only the United States, but the Episcopal Church includes Belize, Mexico, and a couple of other South American countries. So, because the English presence there, in the Church of England, every church eventually broke off and became pretty much its own, but must remain part of what was called the British Commonwealth, which means the Queen technically is in charge. Not the case in the US, and not the case in a couple others, New Zealand, Australia. They're still part of the Commonwealth, but the Episcopal Church is just us and these other few places. Haiti, by the way, is part of the American Episcopal Church. The numbers, you know, are sort of hard to track, but I'm thinking 2.9, which is not many when you consider the fact that of the influence that the church has had, mostly because of its connection to the Church of England. Yeah. Other questions? That's a good one.
Are there particular states where the Episcopal Church is stronger than others?
Virginia.
Okay.
There are more Episcopalians in Virginia than there are Catholics.
Wow.
Every other state, the Catholics usually are the highest number. Utah probably is, it would be LDS, maybe, no, even Catholics in Utah.
Not even.
Yeah, so
Wow.
that's the only one that I know of that's always been the prominent state, and that's the home state, that's Mother State, the Episcopal Church. Massachusetts is pretty large, California has a large population. And Wyoming has one of the smallest.
Percentage wise or just number wise, or do you know?
Yeah. I don't know if anybody's really done a study on that, but I'm just saying that's what it looks to me like.
I wonder how many atheists there are.
And how many atheists?
Well, and then
One
again,
word
you've got to ask the
definition.
question to define that term.
Atheists are those who claim they're something, but they really are not.
But really aren't, yeah. Okay. Oh, Peggy is correcting you to one thing. Barbara Harris was the first Black female bishop, but not the presiding bishop.
No, she was never presiding.
She was never a presiding bishop.
First African-American bishop.
First African-American bishop. And then Michael Curry, is he the first presiding, African-American presiding bishop? Okay.
So.
So why is the AME church?
Yeah,
Why is that
that's a good
Methodist
question.
staying there?
African Methodist, and then there's Methodist Episcopal.
So the question is, where does the African Methodist Episcopal Church come in? What is that?
It's a little statistical thing. Originally, the Methodist Church, after Wesley sort of broke away from the Anglican Church. That's where John Wesley did. He was an Anglican. And actually, I think he even stayed an Anglican, but his breakaway from the Methodist Church, up from the Anglican Church, created the Methodist Church. Originally, it was called the Methodist Society, and then it became a church. And so there were and the Methodist Church called themselves the Methodist Episcopal Church because they had bishops as well. And they wanted to keep that bishop tradition alive. And then when a number of African Americans even during slavery decided they wanted to be Methodist still, they changed their name to the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And it became one of the predominant Black denominations. It's separate from the Methodist Church.
So does AME mean American Methodist or
African Methodist. Yeah. Most of the people out of slavery who were in slavery became Baptists of some kind. But
Who weren't slaves or who were
slaves.
The people who came out of slavery became a Baptist of some kind.
in the AME church.
Is more
They just want to
Methodist.
say more
Episcopalian.
because they were banished to the balconies, in the Methodist Church, and didn't like that. So,
But it has no tie to the Episcopalian Church.
no, not to the Episcopal Church at all.
Yeah.
And to the Methodist Church, I still think they get along fine. And with some of our church unity stuff now, we are coming together. And even the National Workshop on Christian Unity, which I represent our diocese on, meets with them, and they look just like an Episcopal church except their preaching is a little more lively.
Yeah.
So there are connections, and a lot of this is bringing all these churches back together again. And the only thing that really separates us in theology, for the most part, is serving communion. Because the Roman Catholic Church, which sounds very similar and acts very similar to the Episcopal Church, will still not let anyone but Roman Catholics have communion. So, and that's a big issue we're dealing with at the national level.
So do the Missouri Synods.
Yes, Missouri Synod, that's good correction there. Missouri Synod also has restrictions on who can take communion. Not even other Lutherans can do that without a permit, written permit. It's crazy.
The technical term for that is closed communion. If nobody except from your specific church or denomination is allowed to partake of the communion or Lord's Supper, then that's,
The church unity movement, though, it's only the Roman Catholic Church, and obviously the Missouri Synod Lutherans would not be a part of that under any conditions. So, and I believe the Wisconsin Synod is the same.
It's also somewhat up to the presiding priest or pastor. Because I've been in Catholic churches where I know Catholics sitting beside me
Yeah, we'll do
were
that.
served communion.
Yeah,
And I've been served in a Missouri Synod Lutheran church.
Really?
yeah. This is David Rawlings talking, for those of you.
oh yeah. For those of you at home, one of our participants is David Rawlings from Cody area. And the communion issue is determined on a local church basis, even with the denominational differences and
Well,
preferences.
Officially, it's not.
Yeah, no.
They make that issue.
That's like,
pretty
maybe
good.
it's,
Yeah,
don't,
we can't do
don't
that.
ask, don't tell policy.
I've been to a couple places too, and if you go up and take it, who's gonna know? You know, it's a lot of.
Unless you're wearing your green Episcopal Diocese of Wyoming t-shirt.
Anyway, that's a little off the topic here. And if you got any more questions, I'll go to the second half. Second part is based on my book a little bit, which is on sacred ground, religious and spiritual history of Wyoming, which is still doing good. Won the 2012 award for best historical nonfiction in Wyoming. And it talks about how all the church denominations got here and what they're doing in the state, what they did. And but again, it's
So just for clarification, the book itself talks about other denominations, not just Episcopalian.
absolutely, yeah,
Okay.
this is everybody, it includes LDS, includes African American and Cheyenne, it includes a lot of different places, and I tried to get everybody in. But again, one of the things I got when I wrote this book was there was a particular historian here in Cody, who I think people have all heard of in Wyoming, if you've been around, Pete Simpson. And Pete's a long time Wyoming, and it's Al Simpson's brother. And anyway, he's a good historian himself, one of the best. And when he heard I was putting this book together, he said, now there's one thing you got to know about writing a book, because he's done a couple. Whatever you do, don't make it a history book. Don't make it longer than 200 pages or nobody will read it. So mine came out to the book itself, I think, is right about 201 or something like that. So I followed his advice. People do read it because it's not that long. But anyway, Sacred Ground is the Wyoming story and how the faith movement, and I put this in the book, did or did not affect the growth of this state. Everybody thinks, well, churches made a difference in a lot of places. And I tried to find that out. Did it really affect the state, or was it just doing what the state wanted it to do? And didn't come up with a very good conclusion. But I think for the most part, we've been pretty quiet as churches compared to like other states where churches are very active. And there's probably good reasons for that. But so I cover a lot of that, but I begin, as I would do any talk on history of Wyoming, with the fact that this land was not our land. It was native land. People were already here. I grew up like some older people did with, oh, Columbus found America, discovered America. Right. He was lost in this Caribbean Sea and they saved his life, you know. Far from the truth. Native people were here, we know, at minimally 10,000 years. I've heard recently maybe even 13,000. And that's been proven by science. And I think most of the mainline denominations, you know, really understand that. And we understand that Native people were here and they were treated poorly when the colonists came. But I always point out that their record is still here. You can find all kinds of ancient rock writings that tell their story, even though we may not know what that story really was. It leads to much speculation. What I've discovered recently is a lot of the American storytellers, American native storytellers, have their own views. So you can go to one tribe and they'll tell you, oh, those rocks, they mean this. And others will give you another story and say they mean this, but it's important to their history. And they do differ. We know about the petroglyphs. I think we find them all over the state. I like to call them rock art because they were artwork. They were those people's artwork. Scientists call them petroglyphs, which simply means writing on rock. But they convey the story, an ancient story. You'll find these all over. The best ones are still on the Wind River Reservation, although many people can't get in to see those because they're off limits to non-native people. But the biggest one is on the reservation, and you do see its style. It's called the Dinwiddie style from Dinwiddie Canyon. And Dinwiddie has lots of these. They're also technically off limits. Some of them have been overgrown with brush and stuff. You don't see them. I was able, when I worked on the reservation, to go in and actually look at those and hike that canyon, which is fascinating. They don't let people in there because that's where many of the burial caves are that are still used today. They don't want people near the burial caves. Places like Castle Gardens between Riverton and Casper. That's a more contemporary types of, a lot of those are paintings there. It's a beautiful place. Some of you are familiar with Legend Rock, which is close to here, down by Thermopolis. And that's run by the state of Wyoming, technically. And it's got great rock art out there, you know. And a lot of those places are all over the West. You can find them if you know, if a lot of times they keep them sort of quiet. Additional sacred sites for Native people. The Medicine Wheel up on top Bighorn Mountains. Pretty sacred to many tribes, not just one or two. And I've got a couple of great stories about that. Don't have time for it right now. You can find teepee rings most everywhere. And some of them now, some of the thinking is some of those teepee rings may have been ceremonial places.
What do you mean by teepee rings?
They're simply rocks in a circle. They held the teepee down, which are usually buffalo robes or something, because the wind blows in Wyoming and they'd blow them away if they weren't held to the ground. So some of those rocks, some of the old sites you see, they're really embedded in the ground. Some are many sites. And those sites can be found. I know several of them right in the Cody area here. Eagle traps, you still can find those around. These are traps where Native people would hide under a covering and then wait for put some meat up there, wait for the eagle to come down and grab it. So that's how they got their eagle feathers. And those are sacred places. And vision quest sites. I know of one, two, we went to one just a few weeks ago, right here in the mountains, where a Native person could go to just sit for a few days, don't eat, don't drink, have a vision. And again, I sort of wish we're missing one of our students here today, who is Arapaho. And I know he could tell you more about all of that because he lives with, we have another Native person here too, who's Navajo. So this class has a good mix of people here. And by the way, and this is a little side thing, I'm a volunteer for the BLM. That's not Black Lives Movement, that's Bureau of Land Management.
You have no idea the confusion I had when they started complaining about the BLM.
Yeah. Well, this BLM is
Back to our topic.
Land Management. And I'm a volunteer to check some of these sites. They have people who are trained to go out and look to make sure they're not being disturbed.
Oh, good.
And they told me, oh, you on your site, which is over near the Clark's Fork Canyon here, you have a Vision Quest site, but we don't call them Vision Quest sites anymore. We call them resting platforms. Vision Quest is too spiritual for the government, so they changed the names. And I keep reporting back to them, the Vision Quest site is looking, it's pretty good yet. It's not been tampered with. And we also know that our tradition goes back to the sheep eaters, especially in this area.
The sheep eaters?
Sheep eaters into Yellowstone, where the records of them being there. We know of several sheep eater traps that are still in existence.
What are sheep
What
eaters?
is that?
Means we eat sheep.
I would think that's what they.
But does it refer to a tribe or a certain age?
It's part of this, probably the Shoshone heritage. I
Okay,
don't know what the tribe might have been. Maybe.
So it's not actually a trap.
No, it's a trap, yes.
It is a trap.
It's a
for the
wooden
sheep.
trap with and the idea was you herd them down a mountain or into that trap and then beat them on the head one at a time, beat them on the head and get your sheep.
and just for clarification, this was back when these sheep were the bighorn sheep, not the fat fluffy things that the Europeans brought with them.
That's
Vastly different sheep.
Vastly different sheep,
And they're still here.
and are still here, yes.
Well, that's good. We didn't write them out.
So those things are still around. There's evidence of their being here, and spiritual faith played a big part of all those people's history. So I always like to mention that first to make it clear that the settlers, as they're now known, were not the first ones by any means.
So I find it interesting that in all those Native American spiritual places, you did not mention Devil's Tower.
Correct.
You did not mention Medicine Bow Peak.
Well, I don't know much about Medicine Bow Peak other than I've hiked to the top before,
Uh-huh.
but But the medicine bow came from another, the name came from somewhere else.
Uh-huh.
Devil's Tower, yes, and of course, that's very controversial because there's a lot of tribal efforts right now to change that name.
Because that's not the proper name.
It's not the native name. that's
Yeah.
correct. And you see that all over. And that's happening in a lot of landmarks these days. There's a whole committee now to change the landmark names, including in this county.
But
What is-
There's like, I think Mount Rainier in Washington, the original name is Mount Tahoma.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's all over the country. There's a national commission right now that's going around
And
changing.
McKinley National Park isn't McKinley,
Which
McKinley.
McKinley?
What is it
Oh,
called?
that's
What's the
down
name?
Denali.
that's Denali.
Yeah.
It's Denali.
So what's the preferred name, Native American name for Devil's Tower?
I can't remember.
Okay.
I think I've seen two different ones based on which tribe you're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's owned by multiple, well, owned, quote in quotes, by multiple different tribes.
Yes. Just moving along here. The incursion by whites came, of course, with the mountain men, with fur trappers, mostly France, mostly Britain, and later on the US. And they had very little faith concern. They were interested in money. Spanish, same way, incursion in search of wealth. And in the Spanish heritage, which of course is Southwestern California, the faith was imposed on people, Catholic faith. And we don't see that as much here in Wyoming. This whole idea of, I know you've all heard this in history, manifest destiny, was the white people's term for, we're here, this land is open, it's just those native people live there, and they don't have one place to settle, so it's free land, we can have it, and it's our called destiny, a lot of times called by God, to come and take that land and settle it for ourselves. And that's, of course, brought about a lot of those sort of controversies and divisions that happen today. And also it meant manifest destiny meant that newcomers could come and have native lands to themselves. And they came, as we know. The miners came for gold and for wealth. The Mormon migration came west for religious freedom, eventually settling in Utah. You're familiar with that story. The Martin, and by the way, two of their major sites where people died from winter storms are the Martin and Willie companies, which are out in the Red Desert, which this class will get to be in, hopefully, if the weather's good on the last session. And you can go there today and see those sites. They're still maintained. One's by Casper, the Martin site, and the Willie site is by South Pass City. These were settlers headed for Oregon and California, came through those same trails. And this lasted right up until the beginning of the railroad, coming of the Union Pacific, which merged with the Central Pacific. And when that happened, I point this out, when that happened, and that railroad was able to connect east and west with little time, life for Native people changed drastically. Because now they could settle here and actually stay anywhere they wanted, and they did. And a lot of the religious groups that came with those people, missionaries and stuff, including the LDS, were coming out of a thing in New York State called upstate New York. A revival, big revival was taking place. It was so much missionary revivalism going on there, they called it the burned over district. That was what it was known as. And again, you had Joseph Smith came out of there. You had many of the Protestant missionaries came out of there. And they all came west and brought their religious movements to the west. Not particularly successful, however. At first, maybe created a storm, but the West is one of the few places in America where religion has a hard time taking place. So the Protestants followed. The Catholics had been here from the beginning with their missionaries, but they were Catholics. And I say that in that sense because people didn't like Catholics in those days. Protestants and Catholics didn't get along. But the first missionary Protestants came anyway. The Whitmans were the most famous, settled in around Walla Walla, Washington. And there's a big story about them. We could do a whole program on them. But and then of course Mormon immigration came to Utah, but then many Mormons came back into this area to settle in this valley, actually, along with Afton and that. What's that valley called again?
Star Valley.
Star Valley. Star Valley and this valley, many LDS people returned. So you had that. And then you had the Catholics coming back in after they were more welcomed. But there were many that came anyway and came on the railroad and settled in all the railroad towns. The first settlers established their roots in Cheyenne in 1868, because that's where the railroad quit for the winter. And at that same year, Wyoming became a territory. So very few people, when Wyoming first got appreciated as a territory, Congress let that happen because they didn't know how many people were here, and they weren't counting Native people either. UP was completed May 10th, 1869, and so that's when tribes began to face their new crisis.
UP meaning the Union Pacific Railroad.
And I would suggest that it was then that life changed for the Shoshone, for the Arapaho, for the Lakota, for the Cheyenne, and the Crow, now called the Appasaluki, and other Western tribes. But those tribes I mentioned all had a stake in this country, Wyoming.
Why did it change so much with the Union Pacific?
Because now people could settle here.
Okay.
And the Homestead Act took over at virtually the same time. And so people didn't have to go all the way to California, Oregon. You could just get off the train, and many of them was down by Green River, and just go and settle the land. It was yours for the taking. And so the people got pushed. The original treaty in Wyoming Native people was the Shoshone Treaty, 1860, where what is now I-80 and the railroad, all the way to the Owl Creek Mountains, which are just over here near Thermopolis. That was all the original Shoshone reservation. And in 1868, it got made smaller. They took the southern part away and just left what's bigger than the today. And the about that because his family all were dealt with that. And then that was reduced even more. The hot springs in Thermopolis was taken away by treaty. And then a lot of the land on this northern part of the reservation, where the Wind River is, was also taken away later on because the Shoshone people weren't growing crops. And the small print said you have to grow crops. So that land got taken away, and it's now mostly white ranchers who had. And that included Riverton. Yeah, that included the town of Riverton as well, by the way. They took Riverton back. And it was in Riverton where many of these settlers came to actually go out and then settle the land. So you see the Native people really were affected by all of this. But the missionaries started showing up. The Methodists were probably the first because they had horses. And they had circuit riders who liked to ride horses. So they were here first. The Reverend W.W. Baldwin is the name of the first actual person after 1868 to start a congregation. He started the Methodist Church in Cheyenne. The first church building, however, was for the Episcopalians. The Reverend Joseph Cook came a little bit after Baldwin, but as I like to say, Episcopalians are a little more nice and sort of cleanly than Methodists.
Oh,
So Cook waited for the train to go so he could come up by coach.
he didn't want that rough job of riding the horse, huh?
So Cook comes in and he starts what is now St. Mark's Episcopal Church. And they had the actual first building constructed at that time. That's 3 buildings ago. The one you got now is, I think, the 20s.
Which, by the way, is the church we met in,
Yes.
in Cheyenne.
And that's become a very famous church in and of itself. He was followed by a Congregationalist by the name of Josiah Strong. Strong was an activist. He came in and wanted to change all the culture of the West with good intention, He was part of the temperance movement. You know, people drink too much out here.
What was the name again?
CRO
And what?
the traditionalists of the past have turned into today's United Church of Christ, which is one of the more liberal denominations. And Jackson was a church founder. He just started churches everywhere. And Union Pacific Railroad gave plots of land to churches in those days to start their church buildings. And that's why you see along the Union Pacific Railroad, you see a lot of churches, the old churches anyway, that are now become Pentecostal or whatever.
Warren, is that why the little Episcopal church sits on the railroads in Hannah?
That would be why.
It's now decommissioned, but, yeah, okay.
Both the Episcopal churches in Hannah run the railroad.
Hannah has two, or had?
Next to the whorehouse.
Yes, one
Next to the whorehouse.
was the original Episcopal church. The other was an African American church made up of railroad workers. And
Oh, and
they did not have a pastor. They couldn't find one. And so the Episcopal priest came over to do the services for him. They said, well, we can be Episcopal too. And so the diocese made them into the Episcopal church.
So
So in Hannah, we had two. Now we have none.
do they have black people in Hannah?
Yes, they did.
Oh, and by the way,
Multiracial.
Peggy is pointing out that the church in Medicine Bow, which was closed in 2019, that is reopening
Yes.
in a few weeks.
It's going to be a kind of new chapter.
Yeah.
Let me continue on here. I don't want to run out of time, but we're getting down the end. It's sort of a funny story too. All these African Americans did start congregations in Cheyenne, again from the railroad. And there are, I believe, two very active ones there today. But it was so rough in these towns, these railroad towns. I mean, they were really nasty places. They didn't accept religion very well. And it was just, everybody's up for grab. There's one quote from a girl whose family was heading west. And her comment was in great exasperation, "Goodbye, God, we're going to Wyoming." As years went on, and this is another part of the story here, the people who came in the settlers weren't the first ones, the miners were first. But after them came a group of big, wealthy, basically people from England and some from Scotland. And they were here to start ranches, big cattle operations. And as soon as the bison were eliminated, the buffalo were killed off late 1870s. That's when they came and brought cattle. A lot of the cattle were brought up from Texas, but many of these were simply purchased by big English landholders who ironically were from the Church of England. And they set up these ranches mostly in the central part of the state, although most of them lived in Cheyenne. And these were wealthy people. A lot of them were royal connections, and they're sent out here to do just that, start big ranches and make money for the cattle industry, send it back to England. So they were here first, and they sort of took up a lot of the land and didn't like it when other settlers were taking land that they legally could have through the Homestead Act. And so there was a lot of friction going on in the 1870s, early 1880s. And that leads us to a thing that was known as the Johnson County War. I don't know if you heard of that, where some of the little landowners, it's a complicated story, but where the big landowners didn't like the fact that some of their own former cowhands were starting their own operations and oftentimes stealing some of their cattle to do it, caused great friction. And we had this thing called the Johnson County War, which basically was not a war at all. It was a little disagreement amongst them and some violence. The major battle took place in outside of Buffalo at a place called the TA Ranch. And if you ever go there, it's now a guest ranch. You can see where all the battle took place. There are bullet holes all over the place. And eventually, and by the way, for any Episcopalian on this thing, this is where our clergy conference is going to be having its dinner on the Friday night that we're there, or the Tuesday night we're there. But either way, that battle took place. Nobody got killed except killed each other. they shot for a day and a half at each other. The little guys against the big guys, nobody got hit, which means Western story premiere, bad shots. The only guy who we know for sure died was one of the invaders who shot himself in the foot, died of gangrene. So, this changes the movie pretty much. But anyway, that's the kind of frictions you then had.
We have a comment from a Jocelyn Moore. You didn't mention Reverend Alpha Wright, who was a Methodist chaplain sent to Fort Laramie in 1865.
Yeah, there was him, there was an Episcopal guy there too.
Mhm.
I only got so much time. I want to do it.
Yeah,
Because you go Fort Laramie, you got to back up quite a few years. To get
yeah. And she mentions another guy that went to work under Bishop or John Robert.
in Fort Laramie. Found some creative stuff. Anyway, where was I here? With the treaties and the tribes. There were Indian wars, as they were called in those days, late 1860s that preceded that. And that was mostly on the other side of the Bighorns from here. Buffalo, Sheridan, Story, in that area. And that was called Red Cloud's War. And it went on. And basically the tribes won that. They were victorious. And eventually all the forts that were put up there to defend, these were gold miners headed up to Montana during the Montana Gold Rush. And they wanted to go right through territory that treaty had said was for the purpose of Native people to hunt. And they decided, we want to get to the gold and we're going to go right through there. And that's what caused the quote, Red Cloud War. So that got settled finally. The Native folks burned the forts and thought they had won something, but then as it turned out, the later treaties said, you need to get out of the way of all these people coming. And so the Shoshone Treaty, by the way, then was created for what is there today. And it was the Shoshone Indian Reservation. In 1879, along comes some Arapaho who needed a place to stay. They had just been beaten down in the Denver area and were headed north to a reservation they didn't want to go to. And they stopped at the Shoshone Reservation and asked if it was okay if they stayed there. And the government said, sure, you can stay there. Keeping in mind that the Arapaho and Shoshone had been traditional enemies throughout their history. And there's a story that can't be documented, but it's told on the reservation, which I always liked. Somebody asked Chief Washakie, who's really the head of the Shoshone at that time, and lived to be 100 years old. He said, well, what do you think of the Arapaho down there? You still okay with them living? They're living close to what is now Riverton and St. Stephen's. And Blackhole was the chief. And Washakie replied, well, they can stay, but every day I send somebody down there to say, well, when are you leaving? They didn't want them there. It was just a division. That division exists to this very day. And there's a ditch that separates the two sides unofficially. It's not unofficial. It's called the Coolidge Ditch. And it separates the two sides, Arapaho and Shoshone. Although in recent years, a lot of that's been overcome. A lot of intermarriage and a lot more Shoshone and Arapaho intermingling than there were historically. Which leads me now to
What brought the, other than just being pushed out of their own original lands, what brought the Arapaho here rather than someplace else?
they were just headed north to this reservation they were promised that they didn't want to go to. All tribes were given reservations set by the government. And in 1869, by the way, this is something a lot of people don't know, but this takes me into the reservation again. President Grant, Ulysses Grant, was lobbied by the Quakers. And the military ran the reservations in those days, and they were corrupt. They sort of did all kinds of things, to steal money, steal provisions, whatever. And Quakers were against that, and they got Grant's ear. And Grant set a policy to let church denominations run reservations throughout the West. And so they had a meeting in Washington, D.C. at the Interior Department, laid the maps on the floor as it went. and said, the Methodists, you're gonna get these reservations, the Lutherans can get these reservations, the Episcopals got all of South Dakota. And by the way, there's one over in Wyoming called the Shoshone, you can have that one too. And so that's how the Episcopal Church got jurisdiction over what is now the Wind River Reservation. Once the Arapaho moved in, it became then the Wind River, name got changed. So that was all taking place. And then we were under the Episcopal Diocese was that reservation. Actually, the administration of it, even though the administrator was a Quaker. Long story. The bishop in charge was Bishop Randall, who was in Denver. And I got a picture here now. And he came for one visit, maybe two visits to the reservation just to see it. The second one, he was in the original church building, which is on the reservation. And he was surrounded by a Lakota war party. They were having a service inside that building, made up of soldiers and Native people. And the bishop was in there leading this service. And as the story goes, I've got two different versions of it. The Lakota war party snuck around, looked in the window, were going to kill everybody inside. But they saw this strange guy dressed in this strange outfit and said, "This is strange medicine."
He was in his robes.
He was in his robes, meaning the bishop. And they said, "Well, we better not mess with this." So they just stole all the horses and left. The Arapaho version of that and a Shoshone version, but it's a good story. Anyway, that building, by the way, is a log building. It was originally at a place called Wind River. It got moved to what's now known as the Sacagawea Cemetery, where Sacagawea of Lewis and Clark is at least the Shoshone version buried. The priest who was sent there in 1883 was John Roberts. And he began the mission to serve the Shoshone people and eventually the Arapaho as well. And started the first school, taught at the first government school there, and then started his own school for girls right there on a mission. And this is his picture, classic picture of him. He's standing next to Sacagawea's grave. And note the log building in the background. For my research, that building, and we just had a ceremony out there to proclaim it, is the oldest existing church building in the entire state of Wyoming, still standing. The original St. Mark's was torn down and sent to a ghost town. But that building stuck around, and after it was done being used as a church, got moved up to the cemetery and was the maintenance building for the cemetery. It does have a plaque on it that tells its history. And the Episcopal Diocese is going to put a lot of money into that to renovate it, to make it a historic siting. And Roberts lasted for 66 years.
66 years?
66 years. And I hear clergy today complain, "Oh, I'm in my long-term pastorate, they hit the 10-year mark." Well, John Roberts is there for 66. He died at the age of 96. He buried Sacagawea, and he will attest to that. He wrote a note to say that it was Sacagawea, and that he did indeed bury her in Newer. And he buried Chief Washakie in 1902. So the guy had really, there's a lot of stories about him. He's a legend there. He's in the Episcopal Church's calendar of saints, I guess we call it. But he was very influential. And he was joined in 1880, I believe it was, by a native priest who had grown up on the reservation as an Arapaho. And his name is Sherman Coolidge. Somebody just mentioned that, I think.
Yeah.
Coolidge's picture. And he was raised, he was taken by the army after a battle between two tribes, probably Lakota and Arapaho. No, wouldn't have been Lakota and Arapaho, but either way, he was a child abandoned. And a military person picked him up, sent him back east, raised him, and he came back as an Episcopal priest. And he is the first Arapaho Episcopal priest. And then he went on to, he was a pretty colorful guy himself. So, I think we get Allison here. Yes.
Are these graves
Sorry.
in the picture there by the
Yes, all graves.
church? All graves.
All graves. And that cemetery is a very sacred place. And when we're in Lander, we can probably go by and see it. It's done. Allison Sage has joined us. Oh, Allison.
Hello, Allison.
For our Zoom audience, our final participant has arrived. We're all here.
We're just finishing up. 10 minutes earlier, you had discussed the part. I'm talking about the reservation creation. But anyway, to finish that off, the grant peace policy only lasted 10 years. And they discovered the churches weren't any better at running a reservation than the military was. So, and they weren't prepared for it. The Episcopal Church said that they were really not prepared to receive that. By the way, the Catholics had been here for forever and ever with their missions, but again, because of the opposition to them, they didn't get much when they did the handout. They had virtually nothing. And Father de Smet, who was the great missionary of the West for the Jesuits, was at that meeting. And they just didn't want to get him in. He was too old at the time to really do a battle and fight for one. So they didn't get any. As it turned out, it worked out okay. So the grant peace policy was over. Now the government was back in charge. And to finish that story off, Bishop Randall and the mission in 1883, John Roberts comes, 66 years. Reactions were mixed about Roberts. He's adored by many people out there. At the same time, when I was there, I heard some stories about people saying, "Oh, he really was Father knows best." You know, and that was the style in those days. You know, a priest would be the one in charge. So that would have changed directly. And I want to point out, and Sherman Coolidge lasted a few years, and he was very helpful on the Arapaho side. He eventually served our father's house. And then later on, he went to both Denver and to California. So he ended up in California. But he's the first ordained Arapaho priest. And then, of course, a couple of other little notes. Native American Church, I think, is growing to join that collection. The Jesuits came in, and they were pretty effective. They started both St. Stephen's and Italy as well. And but they have since left, I think. Is that correct? They're gone. There's another group.
Yeah,
The diocese took them over directly. But they were there for a long time and made a big impact as well.
When you say the Native American Church is.
Native American Church is Native American, and it's best known to outsiders as the drug I'm thinking of. Peyote, right? It's peyote, right?
Okay.
Yeah, and I understand that is coming back, and so that is their own native, but they keep a pretty low profile, and I know people there, a couple of them who claim they're both Native American Church and Catholic, for instance. It doesn't bother them to be both. And then a couple of little notes just to finish this, and then I have a couple of minutes for questions. The internment center, which you're going to go tour tomorrow, the Heart Mountain Internment Center, which is nicely called a camp, concentration camp, which we.
Well, it should be called a.
Yeah, it should be called a concentration camp because
Not an internal.
her father was there, yeah, and was one of the members, a camper.
Members,
He was a
residents,
camper.
prisoners.
My dad was a camper.
Yeah. Anyway, when you go there, there were churches there, there were religious people. They weren't all Buddhist. Everybody thinks, well, they're Buddhist or Shinto. No, they weren't. A lot of Christians there, and there was a number of Episcopalians, and in particular, a lay reader there who really kept the Episcopalians together. His name was Luke Yakota. I just wrote an article about him in Episcopal magazine. And they created a church there, and authorized by the bishop, called the Church of the Atonement, which is a proper name for that place, I think. Atone for putting people there. You'll hear all about that tomorrow. It's a great place to visit, and it'll give you a good tour, and you can tour a lot of it on your own. It was just a terrible, terrible experience, but a lot of it is still misunderstood. And then I think that's really all I need to say. But the following line is this: Wyoming has had extensive religious experience but very little of that has been in diversity. There are times when we've had Buddhists here, that being one of them. There's still Buddhists, a few in Wyoming. One's on our planning committee. There's Shinto, Jewish, Islamic presence, as you know from the program last week. The Wyoming Association of Churches and all its names has been a way to try to bring unity to as many denominations and faiths as possible. And we are now the Wyoming Interfaith Network, which puts us in that position. And our job is to make a difference as churches have against strong odds, because people never really accepted churches gloriously in this state. In the early days, they tried to kick them out in many cases. But they become stronger, and all new kinds of denominations have moved in, or congregations. But the hope and prayer of this event is that you here in the room, and maybe others watching, will make a difference in this holy story and become leaders who can change a lot of that yourselves. So that ends my monologue. And if you got a few more minutes, if you got some more questions on this part. This is your chance, because nobody else talks about this stuff.
When John Roberts, he came what, 1873?
1883.
83. That was also the period of time when Native American children were being taken from their families and forced into boarding schools, various places.
That happened.
So was that the kind of school that John Roberts was running?
No. In fact, that's one of the first questions I tried to discern when I was working on the Shoshone mission. What do people think about his schools? I asked a couple of the older women, I'm sure have all died now, but who actually were at that school, were in the congregation. And I was expecting them to say, oh, it was terrible. One of them said they enjoyed it. They learned a lot of things about cooking, household stuff. I could pick up no negative stuff, although I'm sure there was. But one of his options is to make this, first of all, to educate girls.
You did say that John Roberts started a school for girls, which would have been unique, yeah.
And that building sadly just burned down a couple of years ago. But he taught also at the actual school, which is in Fort Washakie. And as from what I can tell, and maybe Allison, you have some other stories about this, but from what I can tell, he tried to do his best to make it a contemporary place, but he did come out of that father knows best attitude, which is, well, I do this, I'll do it for you. I'll take care of your problems, rather than let people fight their own battles. And that was the way that missionaries did it at the time. But some of the other stuff was nasty. They did send children off to faraway places, South Dakota. Have you seen the little documentary, Home from School? Have you seen that yet?
I saw that. They went to Pennsylvania.
They to Carlisle, right? And then those women went back recently
You got them.
to rebury them, bring the bodies back to have them reburied on the reservation. And one of the things they sadly found out is the records were terrible, and the dug bodies up weren't the ones. But that movie tells the story very well of how they were just hauled out, and there's hundreds of Native children buried in those places all over the United States that were taken off, not just this reservation, but all the reservations. So that's just a sad story that got told, but both Arapaho and Shoshone have survived, and they're there, and they're doing the best they can do. So, any other questions about any of this? Again, that's a 10-week course put together. And
Yes, 10 weeks, 10-week course in an hour and a half.
It's a lot.
Any questions from our Zoom audience or from our Cody audience?
How long did it take you to write this book?
To write the book?
Yep, how long did you research?
Well, I was doing on and off. I was doing on and off for a long time. I had 2 other jobs too. I started it in 2001 and finished it in 2011, so 10 years. And I did every place that's mentioned in this book I've been to. And I actually tried to feel what it was like. I thought that was the important thing. I love that about history. You can go somewhere and feel what it was like, whether it was, you can feel the spiritual energy in these places too. Walking up Dinwiddie Canyon, I got permission to go up there one day. I could feel the presence of those people buried up there, you know, and what it must have been like and why it's so sacred, you know. Same way for the Johnson County War, just being that place where there's guys shot at each other for 2 days, couldn't hit each other. Yeah. I mean, what was that like? You know, the first thing they did, they killed the horses. The invaders killed all the horses to keep the invaders from getting away, trapped in that ranch house. And I'm thinking, those poor horses, I always hear them, you know, being shot in the barn, you know. But that's sort of what I think history is about, is to go somewhere and feel it for yourself. And so I've been to every one of these places. And I did the research. I did some original stuff I found out. One about the Johnson County War. There's one Methodist pastor there was accused of being part of the townspeople that went out to fight the invaders. And the story went, as was told in several history books, he brought his congregation with him out there to shoot the invaders. And then,
When you say invaders, that's the small farmers and stuff.
These were the big ranchers.
Those were,
With their hired Texas hands.
okay.
To come up.
So the invaders were the big wealthy people moving in.
And the settlers were the little ranchers who had broken off and were doing their own thing and stealing a few cows while they were at it. And anyway, that whole story was very powerful. And I forget the point I was going to make.
You were talking about the United Methodist pastor who was
Methodist
accused of being.
His name was Rader, I think.
Mhm.
And he was accused of bringing his congregation out there and shooting at the invaders. And I found research at Idle Seminary where he has specifically goes out of the way to say, I was not present. I stayed in Buffalo and tried to keep peace in the town and not let it get out of hand. So that was some original stuff I found in research. And the other thing I found out, there's down in Fort Laramie, somebody mentioned Fort Laramie, there's a famous so-called massacre that took place at a military unit. You know, when Native people killed, it's a massacre, and the way people killed it, defending themselves. But the guy who did that, Lieutenant Grattan, it's called the Grattan Massacre. His father-to-be and father-in-law to be, I don't know if he ever married his daughter. He was going with his priest's daughter, the Episcopal priest. And he wrote the document, which I got a copy of, and he proclaimed in the testimony after the investigation that Grattan was drunk when he led that group out that got killed. That he had been drinking and he was drunk when he left. So, you know, there's little things like that you find in historical research. Any others? We're right at 8 o'clock.
We did say we'd end at 8 o'clock. So unless you've got other questions and comments.
Do you have a question?
I don't have a question, but for the Roberts mission and the St. Michael's mission at Ethany, which were both the Episcopals, and the St. Stephen's mission in Arapahoe, which was Catholic, they were working churches, dormitories, with cattle, with milk cows, with chickens. And so they had to work to feed everybody. They all had their jobs. And I'm not too aware of, I'm not familiar with St. Robert's mission. I know where it is, but I never went there. I went to church at St. Michael's, and I didn't hear any stories because it's probably the Shoshones were at Robert's mission, and I'm not sure I think a lot of the stories have died because a lot of those older guys are gone.
Yeah,
that had those stories, and the ones at Ethany. My mother's mom, Eva Felter, she was in that school, and they use older Arapaho children to discipline the younger children.
Was that a good or bad thing?
It was bad.
It was bad. Yeah, yeah.
And I have, I don't know if I told you guys this story or not, but, Jake Whitebloom, who passed away probably, I wanna say maybe 30 years ago, or no, 20, maybe 25 years ago. And his son, Burnett Whitebloom just passed away probably 6 or 7 years ago. And Burnett told me a story about his dad, Jake. And they lived in Arapahoe. And people from the church, St. Michael's Church, came down on a wagon to Jake's house and told Jake's parents, Jake was a little boy. And they said, Jake's gotta go to school, we come to get him. Get him clothes together, so they loaded it on the wagon, and from Arapahoe to Eastleigh, it's about 17, 20 miles. And they took him on a wagon. And the next evening, Jake was back home at Arapahoe.
Yeah,
He walked himself home?
Yeah, he was back home.
there were a lot of runaways, as I
And
saw.
so,
I wouldn't.
so a few days later, the wagon came back from the church and said, I gotta take Jake's gotta go to school. So they took him back to Eastleigh. And Jake told Burnett, he shook his head, he said, son, every time I opened my mouth, Arapahoe came out. I couldn't talk English, I couldn't stop English, because every time I opened my mouth, I talked Arapahoe. And that was, their whole thing was, you couldn't speak Arapahoe. And that's all the only language they knew. So it's, you know, I mean, it's a oxymoron. How do you expect people to talk when they don't know how to talk? So anyway, they punished Jake and put him in a cellar. And when the kids would go to lunch or dinner, they would sneak food and throw it down in the cellar to Jake. And I don't know, you know, he was probably getting malnourished. And he got sick. So they loaded him up on a wagon and took him back to Jake's house, Jake's parents' house. And Jake said he was sick, and he said he was, his parents got some elder men and women to doctor him, to work on him. And Jake said he was on that table, and these old people were around there helping him, working on him. He said he was going up. He was raising himself up, and he could see himself laying on the table with all them people around him helping him, and he woke up. And that's a true story. It's not very old. And it's,
How old is Jake?
well, Jake, when he died, probably 20 years ago, he was probably about 80.
Okay.
So maybe
So he was taken to the school when he was pretty little kid?
1900, somewhere around there.
Wow, 1900.
But you have to realize that we didn't have time to really get into it, but there were some terrible things that were done. I mean,
Yeah.
name changes, you know, and the one story I heard was from pretty good sources that a lot of people were asked on the Shoshone side to come by the agency one day, and they just changed their name. They took them out of either the dictionary or an encyclopedia. And so you got names like Shakespeare.
Shakespeare,
And
really?
you got names like, yeah,
Washington,
Washington.
Lincoln. Brown,
You can't keep your real name anymore. You
Yeah.
have to have an American name.
That's exactly what, I didn't know this until I met this guy in the Air Force, but he was a physician and he had a Japanese last name. And I said, you're Japanese? He said, no, I'm Korean. And he said, what happened was the Japanese, when they went in there during World War II, they made them change their names.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So he had this Japanese last name and he was Korean.
It's
So
crazy stuff.
I know, isn't that terrible?
The other thing, of course, they made them do was cut their hair.
Yeah.
Which is a sign of taking their integrity away,
Yeah.
you know, and if you see some of those pictures, especially the ones in Carlisle and some of the others, those kids were lined up for pictures. They were not happy.
Yeah.
Nobody looked happy.
Because they'd had their haircut
Well, they're,
Well,
and been stolen from their homes and, yeah.
They had really bad hair.
So for the sake of all of us, I'm going to actually, I'm gonna, just a minute. Anne Marie is saying, thank you to everybody on our Zoom audience. And I will say thank you to everybody who came out today, either on Zoom or present in Cody. Thank you, Reverend Warren Murphy, for sharing this with
Love
us.
to do history.
Yeah, obviously.
Yes.
It's fun. For those of us who are part of our Voices of Faith and Leadership program, we are going to get a copy of his book. If you're not part of that program, his book is available on Amazon,
It's available from me, right?
and it's available from Warren, so.
Yeah, you can get it on Amazon, so you can get it used, which is very discouraging.
But thank you for joining us. Thank you. We'll sign off now. Bye-bye.